Hideaki Itsuno has left Capcom. Devil May Cry is done. Dragon's Dogma is done. No longer can people hide behind, well, maybe Itsuno's gonna make a new Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry 5 is one of the best games of the generation. Devil May Cry is one of the best IPs in gaming, other than the first one, which is not very good. Like, this is the greatest thing ever. Like, the Itsuno thing was ridiculous. It always has been. It always will be. But Hideaki Itsuno is absolutely one of those people that was hyped up to be something he wasn't. One of the greatest talents in the industry when his biggest games are all just knockoffs of a far superior one. Hideki Kamiya and the original Devil May Cry. That's right. Devil May Cry 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all inferior to Devil May Cry, which is in of itself a beta test for the original Bayonetta. So, again, the big milestone video game franchise, DMC, is overhyped, underdelivered, and just not even really worth playing, honestly, if we're being completely bluntly honest with you. But no, gamers had to do this thing where they had to hype up DMC as one of the premier action games, as one of the best IPs in gaming, when in reality, not only is it anything special, it's downright bad. Okay. This really needs to be said more. DMC was not a very good franchise. DMC 5 was awful. So, it's interesting to see how people reacted to the failure of Dragon's Dogma 2, because I came out and said immediately that, like, oh, this game is going to be a failure, it's not going to do very well, it's been too long. But no, like, Capcom fanboys, the DMC cocksuckers, they really tried fabricating this narrative that Dragon's Dogma is one of the best action RPGs ever made, that Itsuno was could have delivered one of the best gaming experiences ever, that this was an amazing experience if you could just get through all the jam, right? That was always the narrative when it came to Dragon's Dogma. And then, when Dragon's Dogma 2 came out, what did we get? A basic rehash of the original game after a decade. Think about that for a second. You got the exact same game after a decade. While you were trying to convince people that Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild were the exact same game, they aren't. You were hyping people up for Dragon's Dogma 2. A game that absolutely bombed that release so hard, even the most hardcore of Capcom cocksuckers couldn't damage control it. It was impossible. Nobody liked this game. So, of course, what ended up happening was that everybody just immediately brushed it under the rug and moved on to the next thing, right? Of course, there was no new thing to move on to, but Dragon's Dogma 2 was quickly forgotten about, and now, almost several months later, I don't even remember when it came out, like last year, this year, who knows? Several months later, Itsuno has announced his departure from Capcom. Not long after they confirmed their commitment to DEI and bringing on Western directors onto their franchises. You know, the same idea that Con Man had when he produced Bionic Commando and DMC, right? The Devil May Cry reboot, right? They are doing the exact same thing they were doing a decade ago. You know, Capcom never went away. This is the thing that really gets me about Capcom, and about, like, every major Japanese studio. Like, everybody delusionally believed that the studios were going to make a comeback, that they were putting out good games, that they were going to, like, come back and destroy Nintendo on PlayStation and Xbox, right? We would have a glorious return to, like, the PS2 era of just being able to make fun of Nintendo, right? Like, everybody just assumed that would happen at some point. right? That like the pendulum would shift, and that like Capcom would just embarrass Nintendo over and over and over again, and like we would all just have a hearty chuckle at those childish, immature Nintendo fanboys, right? That was what was supposed to happen, but it never did, right? The talent is leaving, the games aren't coming out. People are just beginning to notice that the lie that Capcom is a top tier video game company is falling apart. And one of the most carefully constructed aspects of that lie that people like Itsuno are hard at work at making new Devil May Cry games is completely falling apart. Like, who at Capcom could possibly produce new video games in 2024 that are worth caring about, right? For the past several years, like I remember when Bayonetta 3 came out, and like one of the big copes from the community, like one of the big things, like, oh, DMC5 is better. Well, even if that was true, it's not. The game was old as dirt by that point anyway, and a sequel was nowhere in sight. So why exactly were fanboys so adamant that DMC5 was better? It was just a cope to keep you from noticing that Bayonetta, even by the third entry, was far superior than the entire 20-year legacy of DMC, right? The reality is Bayonetta topped the entire DMC franchise with the first entry. The second entry of Bayonetta, which is the weakest, is better than the entire DMC franchise, right? And again, this is obvious if you actually take the time to actually play Bayonetta or know anything about it, but DMC fans don't seem to do anything other than like talk about how great DMC 3 is, right? A lot of them don't even seem to have played DMC 1 or 2, right? So when you take all of this into consideration, when you really look at what the Capcoms have been doing over the past 5 years, you really do paint this picture of just this delusional fan base that really has spent years downplaying a company's problems in order to hype up something that doesn't really exist, right? The narrative was always that Itsuno was great. Itsuno was going to deliver. Itsuno was going to put out new Devil May Cries and new Dragon Dogma. He was gonna spearhead like Capcom's relevancy again. Like the Resident Evil games were going to make a comeback. We were going to get new Mega Man games. Like Con Man was the problem, right? Like they did everything they possibly could to avoid addressing the real issue. Is that Capcom is not, and in a lot of ways never has, been producing good video games. The reality is that they cannot, absolutely cannot, compete with Nintendo in any way, shape, or form. And people are in denial about it. Right now, people are doing the same thing for Monster Hunter Wilds that they were doing for Dragon's Dogma. Is that like, oh, this is going to be a glorious follow-up to Monster Hunter Worlds, and it's going to do way better than Rise, and Nintendo is never going to get a Monster Hunter game again, and they're going to go bankrupt, and all the Nintendo IPs are going to go become PlayStation. Like, same code. Exact same code, right? Like, they cannot accept the fact that Monster Hunter Wilds looks terrible, that it looks like a lot of aspects of modern game design, like DEI and Western influences, are ruining this Japanese company. They're refusing to acknowledge that that established talent is leaving. That they're refusing to acknowledge, like the elephant in the room, essentially, is that Capcom is clearly on the decline, and we simply have to acknowledge that.